Chapter 14. For a Dakota bride, the major problem was not that of adjusting to her new status as wife, which was private and personal, but adjusting to her husband's family and relatives, which was a social matter. Waterlily, as the outsider, must integrate herself correctly into the Tashbaye, headed by her father-in-law, Good Hunter. She must take this adjustment smoothly and correctly, or her kinship training at home would be in question. Dakota kinship rules, especially where relatives of marriage were concerned, were very exact and exacting. Her first step was to learn by subtle observation who was what to her, and then she must proceed to conduct herself properly in each case, as prescribed by kinship law. But this was not too complicated after all. Anyone with ordinary intelligence who had been brought up within the framework of the system understood all its intricacies. Nevertheless, a relentless watchfulness was needed, especially at first. So, with this matter constantly on her mind, she was not very homesick. There was too much in her new life to demand her attention. Then, too, she lived on the knowledge back in her mind that her parents would be coming on a long visit. Before leaving, her husband's real mother had invited them for an indefinite stay, and they had promised to come along with the first sizable party of travelers heading south. She could wait for that. Meantime, she would get fully acquainted with her many new relatives of marriage. She would watch her kinship manners towards them all, so that they would know she was well bred, that her people had taught her that most important off lessons, the one regarding her duties towards her relatives. This new responsibility to represent her people kept her very quiet and observant, and she preferred to be a little inconspicuous at all times. That was safer than to be too enthusiastic, and perhaps say or do the wrong things. For the first time, she understood what made her uncle, the husband of Dream Woman and father of Leaping Fawn and Prairie Flower, such a reticent man in their midst. Always he seemed to hold back a little, though he was agreeable and alert to be helpful, and though everyone liked him. It was because he was an outsider. In the Tashbaye of Black Eagle, all were his relatives of marriage. He was like a perpetual visitor. He could never quite relax as he might have at home. Right now, Waterlily found herself having to act like that uncle. This Tashbaye was the largest she had ever known. Good Hunter had a tremendous following of his own relatives, and his wives, and theirs too, though not so large. Together they added up to a goodly number of people. It would not be easy to place so many individuals correctly, but once acquainted, she would see where she fitted into the whole group, and then she would be more at ease, she hoped. No doubt it was to help a bride among her husband's people, or a groom among his wife's, that newlyweds regularly were left by themselves, until the one from outside got his or her bearings. At any rate, Waterlily found it a very helpful custom. The relatives did not make demands on her, or make her conspicuous or uncomfortable by focusing special attention on her, or obliging her to talk, unless she wished. The delicacy of her husband's people in this respect comforted her. Gradually, from each person's behavior toward her, she inferred their relationship to her. For instance, on the morning after her arrival, when she went outside to adjust the wind flaps of her teepee to the prevailing wind, she heard giggling and whispering calculated for her ears. "Hey, watch out there. That's a rope across the path. Don't trip over that log. Look out for the post." She pretended not to hear, but from the corner of her eye she could see 3 boys in their middle teens watching her and grinning good-naturedly. Lying in the next teepee, whose bottom was rolled up all around and propped for ventilation, they were having fun trying to rattle her. Nobody needed to tell her who they were. They were either brothers or cousins of her husband, which put them in joking relationship to her. What they were doing would be extremely rude for others, but it was their privilege to plague a brother's or a cousin's wife in that way, giving her a chance to reciprocate in the kind if she liked. A bit of good-natured rudeness was allowable between them. The boys were implying, "Too bad, our brother or cousin has married a late sleeper, an indolent person, who walks about not yet fully awake. We must warn her." They hoped Waterlily would joke back when she knew who they were. This was their preliminary skirmish to introduce themselves and to find out whether she was the type to enjoy the joking privilege. It was all in fun, to get a rise out of her, if possible. Waterlily found another brother-in-law one warm evening. As she sat leaning against her teepee on the shady side in the afternoon, a toddler or two came toward her. She had a present for her, a bit of leaf. In offering it, he lost his balance and tumbled in front of her. Waterlily caught him and sat him down on her lap. Thereupon, one of her mother-in-laws, who was cooking at the outdoor fire, and till then had seemed not to see her there, called out to the child, "That's right. Embrace her and make love to her. When you are big, perhaps she will leave Sacred Horse and elope with you." She is far too beautiful for him anyway, so Waterlily learned that it was a little brother-in-law that she had held on her lap. Thus went the business of getting the numerous relatives placed. Before the next moon, she had a fair notion of her duties toward them all. Aside from those in joking relationship to her, all the others were formal relatives. Her father-in-law and his 3 wives were expected to be scrupulous for formal, for they were avoidance relatives. They must be distantly helpful and respectful, and their respect must consist in not getting in her way or demanding her attention on them. Her reciprocal role was the same. In spite of this rule, the eldest mother-in-law, Tulata, the senior wife, who was Sacred Horse's real mother, occasionally overstepped by talking directly and in a chummy way to Waterlily. This surprised the girl, for she had never before met a woman so independent of the avoidance taboo. And indeed, some friends of the mother-in-law openly criticized her for it. "But it is too much liberty that you take, the way you talk so freely with your wife, son." To which she replied, What of it? I can't let that rule stop me. She is only a child, after all, and far from her own people because we carried her off. She must be homesick at times. If I can cheer her up, what is so bad in that?" So the two sat together often, talking of pleasant trivial matters, the elder woman doing most of the talking and seeming more like a mother than a mother-in-law. This went on until Waterlily was emboldened in due time to talk more freely. One day she expressed her interest in the size of Good Hunter's teepee. He needed one extraordinarily large to shelter his 3 families, though by now the 2 children of the senior wife, Echo, and her brother, Sacred Horse, were married and had their own lodges close by. "Yes, it is very large," her mother-in-law told Waterlily. 36 of the very largest bull hides went into this tent, and it took a good while to cut and piece it together. Women came to help, and we held feasts every day for them. Your father-in-law selected the poles from the Black Hills, and his sons and nephews cut and brought them in. His old uncle, who understands such work, spent many days in removing the bark and shaving the wood down to make poles smooth and of the right shape. They had to lie unused a long time before they were weathered enough. Waterlily volunteered. "Our teepee had 19 poles. My uncle's had 23. His was bigger than ours because he always had a great deal of company, being head of our tashbaye." The mother-in-law, Tulato, went on to say that the teepees of Good Hunter all required 34 poles, excluding the outside that controlled the wind flaps, and that it took men to raise the poles and hoist the tent. Women alone could not erect a teepee this size. From the first, Waterlily had been struck by the way it was laced up the center back with wooden pins, as well as up the front above the entryway. Now she understood why the heavy tent came in 2 pieces, each half raised separately, it would break one hoisting pole if it were whole. The interior was very spacious for a teepee. Once when it stood vacant, Waterlily paced it off and found it to be 16 of her steps across. Each wife had her own compartment, which she shared with her small children, while the senior wife occupied the hostess space on the right side nearest the entrance. Good Hunter had his own space, and the older children had theirs. 3 young sons of the second wife shared one, and 6 girls occupied 2 spaces, one of the girls being a cousin living with them. Also present were a grandparent or 2, and generally an uncle and his wife or some other people who were close relatives stayed there also. There were spaces for them all. Often, too, some traveler outsider sought shelter for a night, having no other space to stop. It was Good Hunter's boast that no wayfarer was ever turned away, and no visitor, even a casual caller, was allowed to leave without eating a meal. The honor place with a decorated curtain across the entire rear was kept in order, and fancy bags and things were placed there, enhancing the background against which special guests sat to be entertained. Everyone kept to his own space, and there was a certain dignity and quiet order in the teepee, even though so many lived in it much of the time. All the wives, 2 being sisters, and 1 their cousin, were equally responsible for the cooking. Whoever of them was not working at some task that had to be finished started the meal, as a matter of course. Likewise, all the women were equally responsible for all the children, being mothers to them all. Indeed, until an outsider was well acquainted, he could not tell which was the real mother of any child, except the nursing baby. Waterlily was, of course, familiar with the ideal of plural wives, though there happened to be none in her uncle's tashbaya back home. This was her first opportunity to know such a case intimately, and she found it harmonious household. All the wives cheerfully shared the burdens of the family. They took turns in their husbands' affections, and if he seemed to favor one of them overmuch for a time, the others joked about it and let it pass. But even though the wives were co-equal in a sense, it was the senior wife, Tatila, who had precedence. As she told Waterlily with some confidence, "He bought me." Later on, her younger sister had been given to him by her parents, that she might be with her elder sister, to help her and to enjoy her protection. It was customary to do this, especially if the young unmarried girl was motherless and needed the protection and counsel of her sister. Still later, the cousin, an even younger woman, had been added to the household on some plea. Waterlily had known of several prominent men who had more than one wife, and the great leaders, medicine men, hunters, and such influential men could afford to provide for more than one wife and one family at the same time. She had heard, too, of holy men among the Santis in the Far East who had 9 wives. Her father, Rainbow, had been there and seen them. Otherwise, Waterlily would have thought it was only a myth. Well, here was her father-in-law with 3 wives, 3 families in one, and everything ran smoothly. She said so as politely as she knew how. The senior wife laughed. "If you had come 2 years earlier, you might have had 4 mother-in-laws," she said, explaining that the 4th, a complete outsider, was such a troublemaker that the Good Hunter had sent her back to her family in a distant land. Totila, the senior wife, the bought wife, was so sure of her position that she was a bit dictatorial at times, if it seemed necessary. But she was kind and mothered everyone in the family in her crisp way, a big person at heart, as well as in body. She concerned herself impartially over the welfare of her husband, the 2 co-wives, and their several children, as well as her own. Never petty, she was just and good manager of their household economy. When it came time to give a wedding feast for Waterlily and Sacred Horse, she was in full command and made it one of the best and most generous occasions that Camp Circle had known. Come and take my daughter-in-law's hand," She invited special ones, and when they shook hands with the girl in greeting, she gave them fine presents honoring Waterlily. A day came when Good Hunter decided to make a cache and store away their surplus food against the leaner days that never failed to come, sooner or later. Then it was that the senior wife showed her full capacity to organize and direct the entire family in the work. Waterlily was impressed by her executive powers. What must be done was so clear in the woman's mind. It was partly from fear that Good Hunter wanted to hide much food away somewhere at this time. Unlike Waterlily's own camp circle, so remote and complacent, these people were worried. There was incessant talk about the white men and what their presence would do to the food supply. They are coming in greater and greater numbers all the time, and they threaten our herds. They wantonly kill off our friends, the buffalo, and leave them spoiling on the plains. What manner of men are they, to be so wasteful? Are they children? Do they not yet have their senses? If this keeps on, we shall all starve. So talked the men, some saying one thing, some another, but all of it adding up to that and more. To those of lesser vision, it seemed impossible that all the vast herds roaming the plains would be killed off, or that there could be men capable of slaughtering the noble creatures just for a pastime. Yet that was the fear that haunted the camp council. Good Hunter, who expected the worst, called his Tashbaya together. "My relatives," he told them, "this that we hear all around is a bad thing, but a wise man defends, or tries to defend himself. If he fails, he has at least tried. Now, therefore, I am planning to make a cache in the ancient manner and store away all the meat I can bring together. I advise you to join me. Bring other foods too, such as fruits of the earth, and store them away. Then at least for a time we shall eat, ere we die." He turned to the women, including his wives and his daughter-in-laws. All the women sat grouped together at his conference, as at all public meetings, and continued, "Each man will get in all the food he can. His wife will prepare every bit that is over and above her daily needs, cutting the meat as thin as possible for drying and shredding. When it is ready, she will pack it well into as many cases as need be. We shall have room in the cache for every family to store its food. The cases will be laid in storage according to each woman's own things, plainly indicated by the designs of her containers. Some day when food is low, she will have it to feed her family and to offer to visitors in courtesy." Immediately the hunters went out to bring in all the meat possible, and the woman worked till sundown every night, cutting it into the proper shape. Certainly of the elder men who knew the art, meantime went out to an isolated spot under the pines, far from the camp circle, to get the cache ready. They dug a round hole straight down to the length of a tall man's arm, and wide enough in diameter to admit a man. From that depth they began to widen it as they worked down. They pulled up the loose dirt in bull hides as the diggers sent it up. Those on top carried the loads on their backs and dumped the dirt in the tall underbrush, so that no one could see it and speculate on the possibility of a storage cave nearby. When finished, the cache was a clean, roomy chamber far underground. Its shape resembles an immense jar set into the earth. The woman worked fast, preparing the meat for processing. After it was cut into sheets, it was hung on horizontal poles to dry for a day or so in the sun and wind. Then it was ready for treading. A carpet of fresh leaves was spread on the grass, on which the sheets of meat were laid flat. More leaves were put over the meat, and finally a clean hide was thrown over the whole. Then the treading began. Some lively boys around 15 or 16 years of age were put through the sweat bath and were given new moccasins to wear. From then on, all day long, they stamped and beat down the meat under the hide. Sometimes they worked together, stepping in strict time. Sometimes they took turns, one or another pausing to eat and to rest. But always the treading must be vigorous and continuous. And if momentarily the boys seemed to slow down, old grandfathers, now helpless in all else but their tongues, sat by singing their praises to keep them going, or cajoling, and finally ridiculing them good-naturedly. Ecod, they repeated to sneer, why, when we were boys treading meat, and they boasted of their boundless energy at that time. When I was your age, alas, where is the stamina of youth today? And the boys, trying to vindicate their generation, strove all the harder in their efforts to disprove the charge that boys weren't what boys used to be. When it was deemed enough, the treaders were not sorry. It had been hard work in the hot sun. Daily this was repeated, each woman entering meat she had ready. The purpose of treading was twofold. It flattened out such kinks as the meat was drying into, and it pressed out whatever moisture still remained after the meat was exposed outside. After the treading, the meat was hung again to dry thoroughly and through. Day after day, it was kept hanging out until sunset. This treading and drying was done with each new quantity until the senior wife pronounced it thoroughly conditioned for underground storage. By then it had been blanched to a grayish shade from the dark color it was when it underwent treading. The countless steps pressing upon the meat had so completely broken up the fibers that now it was soft and pliable, as ordinary jerked meat was not. With such tenderizing, the meat would eat better when it was cooked. The whole enterprise was an exacting task with benefits far in the future. Each woman packed away her own meat in partleches, flat envelope containers of rawhide. When the four sides were folded and tied up, the containers was oblong in shape, possibly as long as a woman's arm, and half as wide as the length. The sides were painted with bright colors and fragments of bold, distinctive design which, when the case was folded, came together into one complete harmonious pattern. Such containers for dried meat came in pairs exactly alike and were kept tied together. If a woman had more than one pair, they were all painted the same. The purpose was for identification, like a brand. When meat was cached, any woman could find hers by her own design. The pairs were tied loosely together so that it was possible to open one of the cases without the other getting in the way. When carried on a pack horse, one hung on either side of its body. To store the packs of food, one man let himself down into the cache by means of a pole. Standing in the center of it, he received from the men above the pairs of cases belonging to each family in turn, and laid them around close to the wall. He continued in a spiral, leaving room between the cases, so that if one of the family was compelled to open the cache before the others, they could pull out their own cases easily, and the ones remaining would simply settle downward. When the man finished putting all the cases in place, he was helped up and out. The sod on top had been lifted out intact in large pieces. After bracing the opening underneath as seemed sufficient, the men replaced the sod, mending the sutures with dirt and sprinkled grass and leaves and pebbles, so that a passer-by would have great difficulty realizing it was if he should happen onto the very spot, so out of the way though it might happen. They took that chance. Throughout this work, the women kept together and apart from the men. Waterlily saw her husband from a distance during the day, and they might speak in passing or converse if they had to work at something together. But it was customary for men and women to keep with their own kind in public. The married did not demand one another's exclusive attention. Always aware of the presence of other people, they adjusted to them also. Waterlily asked for no more attention from her husband than did other women from theirs, nor would she have wanted it publicly. Rather, it would have embarrassed her. Only within their own teepee did they come together. There they ate and slept, but they did not talk freely together even there. Waterlily was quiet unless her husband spoke to her. He sometimes worried. Perhaps it was wrong to have bought her. Perhaps her heart was not in this marriage. But she shared his life in all ways without demur. She was an industrious homemaker, and she and her little teepee, which her mother-in-law had standing ready for her when she arrived, was always as neat as could be. It was pretty too, of white skins, well proportioned, and therefore firm of stance. When the shape was right, a teepee stood firm, pulled groundward evenly. Otherwise, it was never entirely wind and storm-proof. The bridal teepee was decorated with fancy tassels and other ornaments on the sides, and it was clean and bright inside. Waterlily dreaded winter, when it would be necessary to build an indoor fire whose rising smoke must in time darken the upper half. As it gleamed in the sun, and she was proud of it. Most of the time, so far, it had not been necessary for her to build even an outdoor fire for cooking. A while before mealtime came around, if she was still at work or something, food would be standing inside, ready cooked, for her to serve her husband and herself. The many relatives of marriage saw to that, vying with one another to show her every courtesy. It was well that they did so. Waterlily was tired after a day of heavy work. That was the pleasant penalty of having an exceptionally skillful hunter for a husband. The work of caring for the meat and treating the skin seemed endless, but she did not think to neglect any of it. Her mother had talked to her often about industry, and she had heard the derisive comments of other women about lazy wives. Because she, Waterlily, went at her home task so systematically, her husband's people praised her to their friends. My daughter-in-law is indeed a fine woman, a good worker, and with much skill in womanly crafts. She made this for me. And the senior wife of Good Hunter exhibited a foot neatly encased in a moccasin of much embellishment, the work of Waterlily. But this took place only where Waterlily did not hear or see her. In her presence, little of her work or industry was alluded to, except to complain to her that she was overdoing and ought to rest. It was their subtle way of praising her, by not showing surprise or too obvious gratification, as if she were more of a success than they had hoped. That would be like saying they had not thought her Tashbaye could turn out such a fine girl. Busy and well-treated, Waterlily was getting nicely acclimated to her new environment, and then suddenly she grew homesick. It all started one day. When coming around the teepee, she saw that her father-in-law was placidly dressing his wife's hair in turn. He was sitting at right angles to the middle wife, and had at first unbraided the hair on that side, combed it out all gently, oiled it till it shone, and was now braiding it again. All his wives had very long hair. He was proud of that, because it was a mark of good looks. And as he worked, he chatted pleasantly with the wife. This was a semi-intimate scene indicating the best of relations between the married. Waterlily instantly recalled that Rainbow used to dress Bluebird's hair just like that. It seemed very long ago and remote, that childhood life of hers, when they had sat so. It was a mark of tender affection, and the only bit of demonstrativeness between husband and wife that any outsider was permitted to see. For such things as kissing or embracing, even in fun, were definitely not done in public. Only once in a while a man might indulge himself in performing this simple office for his wife. It was always done calmly and casually, but it was not routine. No affectionate act was ever demanded or taken for granted. A wife did not pout when her husband neglected to dress her hair or pay her any other such attention, for a man was sometimes too busy or preoccupied to enjoy it. Such marks of fondness were not meant to be done like a daily chore. There would be no satisfaction in that for either man or wife. Waterlily watching in a distance, felt a sharp yearning for her own parents. In place of her father-in-law, she seemed to see Rainbow talking quietly about matter-of-fact things to Bluebird, all the while working carefully with her hair, enjoying the feeling of the long strands through his fingers. The thought struck her, will my husband ever do my hair? She knew that some men never dressed a wife's hair, being temperamentally not so inclined, though they might think highly of her. She was sure she would not want him to, not until they were very old, maybe. But now he would be crazy if he attempted it, and she would feel silly enough to die. Newlyweds did not indulge in any such domestic display. They were properly reserved, with reverence, both to each other and to whoever might see them. Waterlily did not want her own hair dressed, but now that scene yonder filled her with longing for her home. It was now the third moon since she had come here to live, and still there was no sign of her family. She was impatient to see them, and at the same time worried lest they strike out by themselves over the wild stretch of no man's land between the camp circle and this. What if they had started alone and their teepee was raided on the way? Oh no, she dared not let her imagination run on. She knew what raids were and what they could do. Her mother had lost her parents that way, and she herself was once in a party that barely escaped one, only because of Rainbow's alertness. The time her little brother, Little Chief, struck first coup. And then when her hidden concern over her people was at its peak, travelers brought word that Rainbow had had to postpone his visit because his aged father was ailing and likely to die soon. Waterlily realized how Rainbow must feel. She loved her grandfather dearly too. How she longed to be there herself. But that he was so ill, if he were to die with her so far away, she thought she could not bear it. Her tears began dropping on the fancy work she was doing. Don't cry, sister, the wife of her husband's cousin who sat with her said. The wives of brothers or cousins were sisters in social kinship. Don't cry. You are saddened by news of your grandfather, I know. But as my father always said, tears are for shedding only over the dead. He was right. What else is worth crying about? Only death, because it is forever. But your grandfather is only sick. He may recover. So be happy, sister. No one has died. She went on again after a little. Or perhaps you have felt some forewarning to make you anxious. Something that unsteadies your spirits, such as a twitching on your face, below your eyes and down your cheeks, where tears are to flow. Or is your body all alive and expectant, as if invisible hands were about to touch you, something like that? Or perhaps have you heard a ringing in your ear? Waterlily recalled that on the previous evening, when she stood alone with her left ear turned in the direction of her home, there had been a loud ringing, as if from far away. It had come directly at her and seemed to penetrate her being. There, that's it. That's the disturbing news you have just received. The sister was delighted with her own diagnosis. But don't you see, she said, your lips haven't quickened. Where your mother has kissed you, your arms have not felt oversensitive where you have held your little brother and sister, nor your shoulders where your relatives have embraced you. Why, even your eyes are free of crying signs. See there? The sister had fully convinced herself. Then she tried, in her clumsy way, to rationalize. But even though your grandfather should die, it will be best for him. You say he is old and blind and alone. Don't you know people like that yearn to die? So do not feel so bad, anyway. We all must die. But that day was the turning point. Before that, Waterlily had been absorbed with the problem of getting acquainted with the very large company of her new relatives. Now having succeeded, she was still not happy. Even though they were all friendly and respectful, something was definitely wrong. Nor was it because of Sacred Horse, though she still felt they did not know each other well. He was very kind and gentle with her, and a good provider. She had much that many girls would wish for. What ailed her anyway? Suddenly, she had the answer. It was that she lacked home people relatives of birth. Everyone here was a relative of marriage. They were his home people. He was free to be himself in their presence in a way that she was not. This was to be expected, of course. All her life she had seen avoidance respect, and thought it was entirely proper. But being so recently placed in this new situation, where she must live in its formal atmosphere exclusively, she found the strain becoming too hard for one so young and so far from home. She needed family relatives such as Sacred Horses was enjoying in his own Tashbaye. She needed an environment charged with parental affection, where she could indulge her moods and could be herself without restraint. Parents, uncles, aunts, and grandparents humored you, even spoiled you a little. Before you could be outspoken, impudent, and perhaps say or do silly things, with the assurance that they would understand. Waterlily needed her menfolk too, her brothers and cousins ready at all times to protect her and give her social backing. Without them, a woman felt insecure against. She did not know what, but she felt as if here she stood vulnerable and alone. The environment of the family of marriage obligated one to play an adult responsible role at all times without slack. The kinship law so ordered it. Life in the Tashbay of Sacred Horse was, for Waterlily, like wearing ceremonial dress all the time, and how she longed for homely easy clothes, in which to drop her dignity now and then. Few persons were idealistic enough to kick over the kinship traces as the senior wife did to make her son's young wife feel at home. Waterlily was grateful to her for that, but it was not enough. She dare not break rules too, and behave like a careless child towards her husband's mother, however informal the older woman was. Her son's wife was still her daughter-in-law. If only I had one person in the camp circle that was a family relative, so I could relax in her presence just once. Among all these people, Waterlily sighed. Everyone is an in-law to me. As if in answer, unbelievable as it seemed to her, a man and his wife came one day to visit Waterlily, calling her daughter. The woman embraced her with motherly tenderness. My daughter, she explained. We learned only last night on our return home who it was that has become the wife of Sacred Horse. You are in good hands, daughter, for this is an able and upright family where you will always be treated well, and indeed they should be proud of you. I am sure they are. The woman had brought Waterlily courtesy food and gifts. Your brother Redleaf it was who told us about you, she said. Redleaf, my brother. Waterlily tried to think where she had heard the name. All at once it came back. Why, Redleaf was a little boy with whom her brother Oya played during a tribal reunion some years ago, before the trip to Pawnee's camp circle. She remembered how the two boys took an instant liking to each other, and how Ohia, in his eager fashion, had made a friendship pact with his playmate. How he had come in breathless and solemn to announce to the family, we have gone into fellowhood. Bluebird and Rainbow had accepted the news, a little doubtful, reminding Ohio that such a friendship was for grown men who understood the heavy obligations that were prepared to face them always. Maybe when you are men, you will not be sure that is what you want, Bluebird said gently. But that did not deter Ohio. His sister recalled, smiling. Such a little thing, children imitating adults. And yet here it was working out to her advantage, for here were people she called her father and mother. Waterlily remembered that Rainbow had said to Bluebird, "It seems like playing with a sacred matter, doesn't it?" But Redleaf's parents had taken the matter seriously and approved it so much that there had been an exchange of presents, and then the two fellows were separated and were seemingly destined never to meet again, at least as playmates. Daughter, the woman did all the talking, or nearly all. We would have claimed you sooner, but we have been in the Black Hills, where your father has a white man friend. Lean white. White man, she calls him, and a good name it is, too, for he is very thin and long and weak-looking, but so active. The way he can work would surprise you. Whenever he goes far away towards the sunrise, we camp near his cabin to guard it for him. And when he returns, he brings us very fine presents, like these dishes of metal I have brought you. Waterlily could hardly believe that a Dakota and a white man could be friends. And this white man, my mother, she said, are you sure he is really good in his heart toward my father? How may my father know, since he cannot understand his language? Oh, but your father does. The woman was very complacent. Say something for her. Well, and he cleared his throat in preparation. He calls me Injun. That means Dakota in his language. I say, got tobacco? When I want a smoke, it isn't hard. And too, my friend talks some Dakota, so we get along. Oh, he is my friend, all right. The wife cut in. He gave your father many fine things to bring home. I have for you a piece of red blanket, flannel too. He gave him knives and spoons and blue as well as red cloth, even a holy iron gun to shoot with. When the new-found parents of Waterlily prepared to leave after eating the good meal she had served them, the woman said, Daughter, we live exactly opposite across the common. Return home whenever you feel like it, and spend the day with your own relatives. She indicated the direction with a quick upturned thrust of her chin, over her hands being full of return gifts from Waterlily. Do you see the tallest teepee? The one with its upper half painted blue? Well, that's not it, but the second one on the left, the next tallest, that's it. It was the habit of the people to eliminate other similar objects until they isolate the one they wish to point out. Not that, nor that yonder, but the other. The father added his invitation. Come soon and often, my daughter. You have mothers and aunts who will prepare foods you like. You have fathers and uncles and brothers, sisters and cousins, and you have especially your own little brother, Red Leaf. You have sons, daughters, nieces, and nephews, and many grandparents. They are all eager for a sight of you. When they had walked off a few paces, the woman turned and said, Why, I nearly forgot. You even have a grandchild now. Your eldest sister's son became the father of a baby girl only yesterday, so come and see your granddaughter. They cut across the common, walking one behind the other, with the man leading. Watching them go, Waterlily felt relief. From now on, things were going to be easier. Here were people with whom she could be herself, without stopping to consider her dignity. Kinship came in halves, the family of birth and the family of marriage. In the one, a person was permitted to play the child occasionally, in the other she must strictly play the adult, as a matter of self-respect. Once having accepted an adult role, Waterlily had been cramped in a one-sided society. Now, with its complement, she was going to manage all right. It was best to have many contacts. Having both kinds of relatives kept life in balance. The fact that these new parents were nothing like her own father and mother made no difference. They were older and not nearly so handsome as Rainbow and Bluebird, but they did not think to draw comparisons. It was what they symbolized, what they offered Waterlily that mattered. Being a respected daughter-in-law was all right. The difference continually showed her was pleasant. The challenge to reciprocate that deference as smoothly and correctly offered no problem. She had been too well trained in all the intricacies of kinship courtesy and behavior to make mistakes. But now she could cast aside that formal role occasionally and be somebody's child, and she was glad of that. Now if only Bluebird and Rainbow would arrive for that long visit and renew their relationship with these kindly local parents of hers, life would be perfect, she thought. And then she remembered what it was that was preventing their coming immediately. She thought again of her poor sick old grandfather and was sad again, but not quite so sad.